Hello, I am Jenna Lopez. I'm the Research and Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Learning Network. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar series, co-hosted by the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. The Learning Network and Knowledge Hub are proud to organize and co-host this webinar series. The Learning Network is a knowledge mobilization initiative that bridges the gap between current gender-based violence research, practice-based knowledge, and lived experience, strengthening the capacity of the GBV sector and movement. Mobilizing knowledge on GBV is crucial for preventing violence in diverse communities, supporting survivors and allies, and promoting gender equity. The Knowledge Hub facilitates a trauma and violence-informed community of practice for projects conducting intervention programming and research for people who have experienced family violence, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. To learn more about the Learning Network and/or the Knowledge Hub, please access the website links posted in the chat. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to this webinar, Nowhere to Go, Confronting Canada's Housing Crisis and Advocating for Change for Survivors of Gender-Based Violence. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewack, and Chinookan nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We offer our deep respect to the original stewards of this land and recognize that acknowledgements of Indigenous sovereignty must be accompanied by ongoing learning, accountability, and action. In a session focused on housing insecurity, it is essential to recognize the history and ongoing role of colonization, including the systemic dispossession of Indigenous lands, land theft, and the denial of Indigenous peoples' rights and access to housing, safety, and self-determination. Indigenous peoples continue to face profound and systemic housing disparity and insecurity, conditions that are deeply connected to gender-based violence. The ongoing housing crisis we are discussing today cannot be separated from this history. From forced displacement and the reservation system to housing discrimination, underfunded infrastructure, and homelessness in urban and northern communities, Indigenous peoples continue to face profound and systemic housing disparity and insecurity, which is inextricably linked to gender-based violence. We also acknowledge those who were brought to this land involuntarily, particularly those affected by the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, and recognize the enduring impact of anti-Black racism and dispossession on access to housing and safety. The Learning Network and Knowledge Hub recognize our responsibility to ensure that our work challenges colonialism, anti-Black racism, and all systems of oppression that shape who has access to safe, secure housing and who does not. We commit to continuing our work in solidarity with Indigenous and racialized survivors, and to supporting sector-wide efforts that advance housing justice as part of gender justice. We are pleased to be joined today by Sophie O'Manick and Sarah Laisney from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to briefly mention that they are both joining us from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, or CCHR, Canada's leading organization working to advance the right to housing. CCHR supports renters, conducts research, and advocates for rights-based housing policy at all levels of government. Sophie O'Manick is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights and a PhD candidate in geography at the City University of New York. Her work focuses on advancing housing justice through research, especially in relation to marginalized communities, including survivors of gender-based violence and newcomers to Canada. Her doctoral research explores the financialization of housing in Canada and the US, with a focus on gender, race, and class. Sarah Lacey is a senior policy advisor at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. She brings a background in architecture and urban planning and has spent the past decade advocating for the right to housing, both in Canada and internationally. At CCHR, she develops policy submissions and practical tools to advance housing rights using a human rights-based approach. You can find more details in their full bios in the link provided in the chat. Welcome, Sophie and Sarah. I will now pass it over to you to begin your presentation, and I look forward to rejoining you for the Q&A session that follows.
Hi there. Thanks so much, Jenna. And thanks, I want to thank all the folks at the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub for having us here today and for all of the work that they've done to support this webinar, including interpretation. I join you here today from Jojoge, also known as Montreal, on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And Jenna provided some really important context in terms of in her land acknowledgement in relation to the housing crisis. And, in a context of a housing crisis where First Nations and Métis and Inuit people disproportionately experience housing insecurity and settlers disproportionately reap the profits of rising land values, I really think that this is important to hold with us today and keep in mind as we move through our discussion. So today I'm going to share with you some research that we undertook in 2023 and 2024 on the intersection of the housing crisis in Ontario with another crisis that is one that, of course, many folks on this call are deeply familiar with, and that is endemic gendered violence. So I'm going to begin with some context about the housing crisis before sharing our research. And then my colleague, Sarah Lacey, Senior Policy Advisor at CCHR, will share about our policy advocacy in this area. And I know many folks are involved in advocacy in this area, but she's going to share some targeted strategies for beginning to address these interlocking crises in Canada. So next slide, please. It's probably not a surprise to folks that Canada has been experiencing a housing crisis. It's a pretty hot topic right now. But in talking about housing crisis, I really want to acknowledge that for many people in Canada, housing has been in crisis for decades, if not centuries, on this land. And so I like to keep that in mind in talking about a housing crisis, but in recent years, this housing crisis has deepened and come to impact larger numbers of people. So in terms of the numbers, we have 1.7 million households or 3.3 million individuals in core housing need. And core housing need is a metric that is used by Statistics Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, often referred to as CMHC, to assess the number of people that are living in unsuitable or unaffordable housing. Over 118,000 people accessed emergency shelters in 2023. 67.8% of those people who accessed shelters identified as men, 31.1% identified as women, and 1.1% identified themselves as gender diverse. And we know for various reasons, including that many folks don't feel safe accessing shelters, that women, trans, two-spirit, and gender diverse people disproportionately experience hidden homelessness and other forms of homelessness that aren't captured by official statistics. 1 in 3 GBV shelters reports turning people away due to a lack of beds and reflecting the sort of chronic underfunding of these spaces. And between 2021 and 2023, asking rents in Canada increased 23%. And so asking rents, those are the rents that if you go out and you look on Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji today for an apartment unit, those are the rents that you're going to be encountering. And I want to note in sharing this increase that rents were already quite high in many places in 2021. So today, the average rent and average rents are different than this asking rent figure, because average rents will include long-standing tenancies that may have been subject to rent control. And so if someone's been living in a rent-controlled apartment since the early 1990s, that unit is going to be more affordable. So those units are going to be captured in an average rent metric. So the average rent today is $2,127, and that's going to be a lot lower than what people will be encountering looking for a new unit on the market. And then the national average home price is now $679,866. There's a lot of regional variation here. And overall, these prices are just untenable for so many folks. Wages have not kept step. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? I think we hear a lot of different explanations that we don't have enough supply or we have too much migration. And a lot of these explanations are simplistic at best and can become racist at worst. And they tend to sort of obscure the more complicated drivers of this housing crisis. So in the 1990s, the federal government downloaded the responsibility for housing and public housing to the provinces. And at this time, they stopped building and funding public housing largely. So there was a time when 20% of new housing construction was public housing in the 1960s and 70s. And now for several decades, that number has been 0%. Sorry, I'm just closing the chat here. And this was part of a shift away from government investment in public, social, and essential services. So we've seen them pull back from healthcare spending, social service spending, and education spending, among other areas. And at the same time, we saw provinces roll back tenant protections. So we have the erosion of rent control, the creation of loopholes, things like vacancy decontrol, which means that landlords can raise rents as much as they want in between tenants, giving them an incentive to pursue tenant turnover. And all of these factors, plus low interest rates, mean that housing became an attractive investment. And as there was more housing demand, housing prices began to increase significantly. And this is really all happening in a context in which fewer people have access to decent pensions, meaning that for many, their housing assets became a retirement plan. And this is glossing over a lot of history in one slide, but it's slightly more complicated than, just trying to understand it as pure supply and demand or too many folks coming. Next slide, please. And, housing is something that is different than other things that we buy and sell. And there's a tension between our need for housing, how we use housing as a socially necessary refuge from the world, that is a precondition for many other aspects of our lives. And, for survivors in particular, it's a precondition for living a life free of gendered abuse, for feeling secure, for accessing other services, for healing. And there's a tension with housing as something that we buy and sell and use as an investment. And our government policies have often emphasized this economic value over this social value of housing. And I think for many of us, and for few groups more than survivors, this is really creating immense challenges. So today, housing is an asset class. It's what we often refer to as the financialization of housing. 1 in 6 Canadian homeowners own multiple properties. Institutional investors own an estimated 20% of our purpose-built rental stock, and they are going to have different objectives than, what we sometimes call like a mom and pop landlord who um, are perhaps more responsive to their tenants because they're engaged with them every day, but there's this sort of layer of separation when you have an investment firm owning rental housing. It's more complicated than this, but their primary responsibility, their legal fiduciary responsibility as an institutional investor is to their shareholder rather than their tenant, and that creates some different dynamics. And so overall, we have a really high demand for housing. And these systemic drivers directly shape the options or lack thereof available to survivors in seeking safe and secure housing. And so when we talk about housing precarity, it's not an abstract issue. It's playing out daily in the lives of women, trans, two-spirit, and gender diverse people across this country. And to reiterate, for survivors of gender-based violence, housing is not just shelter, it's foundational for safety, stability, and healing. And without it, without access to adequate housing, as the research study I'm going to share with you will demonstrate, leaving an abusive situation, protecting children, or accessing other supports can become extremely difficult. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch on some of the sort of intersectional implications of this housing crisis. The housing crisis is not impacting people evenly along intersectional lines. And I'm also, before I sort of get into the information presented in the next two slides, I just want to note that we're using the term Women Plus to reflect the language used by Statistics Canada from where we're drawing this information. And that this category that Statistics Canada uses and that folks, have rightfully raised issue with includes trans, two-spirit, and gender diverse people who are also disproportionately impacted by housing insecurity and gender diverse and gender-based violence. So women experience a higher incidence of core housing need than men. 21% of Women Plus renters experience core housing need. 18.8% of racialized Women Plus are in core housing need compared to 8.5% of white Women Plus. We know that 21% of lone parent households headed by Women Plus are in core housing need, and 14.6% of Women Plus over the age of 75 experience core housing need. And in this housing crisis context, housing instability is both a cause and consequence of gender-based violence. And so what I mean here is that people are forced to remain in situations in which they're experiencing GBV because of the housing crisis. And I would absolutely consider these folks housing insecure. And there have been sort of efforts to include people experiencing gender-based violence, but remaining in that housing in homelessness counts. And people are also forced into deeper housing insecurity or forced from their homes because of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So 1.7 million households or 3.3 million individuals were in core housing need in 2022. We see that renters are experiencing this at a higher rate than homeowners. We see that Black households, West Asian households, and Korean households are experiencing core housing need at a higher incidence than the general population. We also see that Indigenous households experiencing core housing need at a higher incidence than the general population, and senior women are experiencing it at a higher incidence than senior men. So the housing crisis is really not being borne equally along intersectional lines. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn to our research study now, and our research study actually engaged with 3 key questions, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on 2 today. The third question focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, and the report will be attached in the accompanying resources. So if you're interested in that piece, you can find out more about it there. So our research employed an intersectional framework, and it set out to answer two key questions. Do high housing costs impede the ability of women and gender diverse people in Ontario to leave contexts in which they are experiencing GBV or IPV? And do different housing market conditions and characteristics impact the ability to leave a domestic partnership in which an individual is experiencing GBV? And so really trying to understand um, how experiences are different in different sized communities and with different housing market conditions. A lot of research tends to focus on major urban areas. And so we really wanted to capture a diversity of experiences geographically in this research, while of course being focused on Ontario. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we selected 5 different research sites with different characteristics and housing circumstances because we wanted to see how people were experiencing these crises differently in different contexts. So our 5 sites were Toronto, Ottawa, Peterborough, Thunder Bay, which also acts as a catchment area for many northern communities, and then Lanark County, which is a sort of more rural county close to Ottawa. Next slide, please. And we employed 4 key methods. I'm not going to go into too much further detail here. They're outlined quite extensively in the report, which is included for the resource list for this presentation. But we conducted an extensive literature review, a housing market conditions analysis of the 5 research sites, a survey of survivors who have experienced housing insecurity across the 5 research sites, and interviews with individuals working in service provision to survivors of GBV across the 5 research sites. And you can read more in the report about our sort of justifications for using these methods and how we went about it. And next slide, please. So what did we find? We found that Ontario's housing crisis, which perhaps is not surprising to folks on this call, but is acting as a significant impediment to anyone leaving a context in which they are experiencing violence. Survivors are facing a high degree of housing insecurity that originates from their experiences of GBV and is compounded by Ontario's housing affordability crisis. So 79% of participating survivors shared that high housing costs were a barrier to leaving a context in which they were experiencing violence. And I want to note here that, as many folks on this call will know, we do have sort of a framework service delivery where the onus of leaving a context in which they're experiencing violence is generally on the survivor. And we'll pick up on that piece a little bit when Sarah shares with us about advocacy pieces. We know that there really aren't many units available that are affordable to households with one income in communities across Ontario. We found that survivors who leave are facing a very high degree of housing insecurity that originates from their experiences of GBV. So we know that people are staying in shelters for longer, that people are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, that people are couch surfing, and that in some instances we heard that folks were landing themselves in prison for the winters without better options available to them. So this research details this. And this housing insecurity is very much compounded by Ontario's housing affordability crisis. We found that most survivors were not able to access private market housing based on a whole range of barriers that we'll discuss in more detail. And that accessing social housing through the special priority policy, which most provinces have a priority policy to give survivors the opportunity to access social housing sort of at the beginning of the list, but we know that now takes years to access. And we also heard from people working in service provision that they too experienced housing insecurity. So the price of housing has risen in communities all over Ontario over the last 5 to 10 years, and wages have not kept pace. And investments in community services um, have also stagnated. So we know that folks are working really hard to keep shelter spaces and other programming running with few resources available, and that this is also translating into service providers themselves experiencing housing insecurity. Next slide, please. So, with steep barriers to accessing adequate housing in the private market and long wait times to access social housing upon leaving emergency shelter, our research found that many survivors are experiencing further housing insecurity and are unfortunately returning to live in abusive contexts or ending up in other precarious living arrangements. And I want to note too that in some of the smaller communities that we conducted research in, that this situation is actually fairly recent. That housing navigators actually shared that even as recent as 5 years ago, it was feasible to find some housing for survivors in the private market. And I'm going to share some interview quotes that speak to this. So the next slide, please. So one frontline worker in a mid-sized community told us, my work used to be helping women leave, and now a lot of my work is helping women stay as safe as possible while they stay. Next slide, please. And when you get into a shelter, our shelter, you get a 3-month stay. And years ago, you could at least work through that. Now in 3 months, we're finding a whole lot of nothing. So not only when they come into my office, we start talking about your moving on plan almost instantly. We've really removed that space, what we used to call the honeymoon, the time when you get safe and get centered. We almost have to start talking about moving on plans right away now. And when they sit there in my office and we're asking, what's your budget? And we're talking about a budget of a mom who's on ODSP and she makes $1,800 a month, she ain't finding nothing. Next slide, please. So we also found that survivors are facing significant barriers to accessing private rental market housing beyond cost. Only 10% of survey respondents found housing in the private rental market, and 42% shared that they experienced discrimination in searching for rental housing in the private market. And this discrimination came really in all different forms. It may have been family size against a multi-generational or single parent household, could have been based on race, immigration, status, or indigeneity, receipt of social assistance, the presence of a disability, their gender, presentation, a presumption that they were using substances, etc. And the research also found that rental applications can be discriminatory and used as a tool to discriminate, even if housing providers aren't engaging in outright discriminatory language. So when folks are coming from northern or rural communities or are newcomers to Canada or have experienced economic abuse or have worked in informal sectors, they may not have a credit history or the documentation required to, fill out one of these rental applications that are now extremely widespread. And that effectively precludes people from accessing housing. Next slide, please. We learned that private rental market housing actually is rarely an option for folks at this point. Again, only 10% of survivors surveyed reported accessing private rental market housing. Onerous rental applications, I already touched on this piece, really are precluding folks from accessing housing. And in smaller communities where housing has typically been owner occupied, there just wasn't rental housing units available in some instances that would be appropriate for folks trying to access housing. Smaller communities in particular, without public transit networks, the barriers to finding housing where someone can access childcare or a laundromat without having to constantly take a taxi are immense. In smaller communities too, we learned that there are issues with anonymity where everyone knows each other. Survivors may not be able to find housing that is not in some way connected to an abuser. And when survivors can access private rental market housing, our research found that they often were faced with both unaffordable and unsafe housing conditions, and were even subject to further abuse from landlords. A lot of the housing that is available to folks on a single income is also not in a good state of repair. Next slide, please. So now you have applications where you also have to come up with references in the private market, and you also have to sign off on them checking your credit background. This is like next to impossible for a lot of people who live up north or are coming from rural areas because we know the credit is going to be pretty shabby. And so this was a frontline worker in a small community. Next slide, please. So in terms of intersectional considerations, and this is continued on to the next slide, the report documents many gaps in existing programming for people with disabilities, gender diverse people, people who use substances, people who do not speak English, and with other complex needs. And this is the case even though these populations tend to experience GBV disproportionately. Not all shelters have the capacity to provide the supports that people with disabilities and people with significant mental health challenges and people who use substances need. And folks are being turned away based on these factors. And meanwhile, we have a higher proportion of individuals trying to access services who are presenting with disabilities, complex needs, and mental health challenges. And so the outcomes for survivors are very different along intersectional lines. And if you can, next slide, please. So this is speaking about some of the discrimination experienced by Indigenous folks in particular who were trying to access housing through rent, we're trying to access housing through rent supplements and portable housing benefits. So in that scenario, the landlord gets to interview 3 people and then they get to pick their person. Our Indigenous clients never got picked. It was kind of debilitating. So here they are thinking, oh, I might get housing, and they go through this and they're nervous about it, and they really never got picked. And a frontline worker in a large city shared with us, for non-binary and queer identifying clients, entering shelter is sometimes a very specific risk in terms of whether they want to be changing their gender presentation to increase safety. Next slide, please. So there are further gaps in existing programming available for people with disabilities, gender diverse people, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous people, and survivors with children. And there's not enough programming targeted specifically at specific groups. This time there's only one shelter in Canada that is specifically for queer identifying people, and that shelter is in Toronto. There are not many shelters accessible to families and intergenerational families in particular. These gaps are more acute in mid-sized, smaller, and rural communities, and we heard about people traveling for hours to access a program that they felt safe in or that met their needs. Next slide, please. Provincial programming designed to prioritize access to social housing for survivors is not currently resulting in survivors being housed, is something that we heard in all communities. So the special priority program has many barriers, including documentation, that are really immensely difficult for people who, and there's a time frame of 3 months to access it, which makes it immensely difficult to qualify for. And none of the survey respondents reported accessing social housing after leaving emergency shelter through the special priority policy. Other benefits too, like the Canada-Ontario housing benefit, did not seem to routinely be resulting in survivors accessing housing, and benefit rates are just simply too low. I'm talking about Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Pension to access housing. And next slide, please. So I think about this quote often that somebody shared with me. It's just because the accuracy. But poverty is policy in Ontario. All of our benefit rates and minimum wage rates are far below the poverty line. And so the special priority rent geared to income city housing, if you don't have a fixed address, you can't receive mail. This city's housing corporation, as an example, sends a request to update every year. If you don't update it, they remove you. So I have women who have thought they've been on the list for years and haven't been because they were removed. And that's it for my proportion of the presentation. So I'm going to now pass it over to my colleague, Sarah, to talk about CCHR's advocacy in this area and how we can sort of become involved in addressing these challenges that survivors face in accessing housing to create better outcomes for survivors.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Hi, everyone. So for the next part of the presentation, I will walk you through a rights-based approach to developing policies that address GBV prevention through housing security. And we're going to use the results of Sophie's research and other research that CCHR has contributed to. So first, we will look at the kind of obligations that Canadian governments have towards survivors of GBV under international law. We will then look at the gaps between these obligations, what is being implemented, and the impacts of current housing policies on survivors. Finally, we will explore policy solutions to bridge those gaps and what you can do to advocate for these solutions. Next slide, please. So Canada has signed several international treaties that protect the right to housing for women and other groups that are most at risk of experiencing GBV. First, there's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or ICSCR, and this is the treaty that affirms housing as a fundamental right. There are other treaties that reaffirm the right to housing for the groups most impacted by GBV, namely women, racialized women, Indigenous women, and women with disabilities. So there's CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Then there's ICERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there is the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So these treaties contain human rights protections to ensure that these groups can have equal enjoyment of their right to housing. First, all of these treaties state that women, Indigenous people, racialized groups, and people with disabilities should be protected against discrimination. In addition, the ICSCR explains that the right to housing should be ensured to everyone, regardless of their income or access to financial resources. There are also equity measures provided under these treaties to make sure that women, Indigenous people, and people with disabilities do have equal enjoyment of their right to housing. For example, the UN committee responsible for overseeing the implementation of CEDAW recommends that women survivors of GBV should have access to shelters and other social supports. UNDRIP states that Indigenous people should have decision-making power about housing programs affecting them and the right to run these programs through their own institutions. Finally, the CRPD explains that people with disabilities should have access to barrier-free housing and services to ensure that they can live independently while being included in the community. So in a nutshell, what these treaties mean for survivors of GBV is that they have a right to housing that is safe, adequate, and affordable. They have a right to not be discriminated against because of their gender, race, ethnicity, disability, or economic status. And there should be equity measures in place to ensure they can enjoy the right to housing on an equal basis with other groups. As a signatory to these treaties, Canada has an obligation to realize the right to housing for survivors of GBV. And this obligation applies to all levels of government. This means that the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments should take concerted actions to ensure that first, there is enough supply of safe, adequate, and affordable housing, that the groups most impacted by GBV are not discriminated against in housing, and that housing programs are tailored to respond to the housing needs of survivors. So Canada has taken steps to advance the right to housing and fulfill those international obligations through the adoption of the National Housing Strategy in 2019 and the implementation of the National Housing Strategy since 2017. But there are several funding, policy, and legal gaps that need to be addressed. First, we're going to talk about the need to address a lack of understanding of the issue. So as the research led by Sophie demonstrated, gender-based violence is a housing issue. We see that more and more women and gender diverse people are experiencing GBV and housing insecurity in spite of significant investments in housing under the National Housing Strategy. This is because current housing programs rarely consider the unique ways in which women and gender diverse people experience housing insecurity and its intersection with GBV. A clear manifestation of this intersection is that amongst women and gender diverse people who have experienced homelessness, 75% are survivors of GBV. Next slide, please. So to create gender-responsive housing solutions, it's essential to consider how survivors of GBV experience homelessness and the kind of barriers they face to exiting homelessness. So let's look at the first column in the diagram to the left, which speaks about escaping abuse. First, it's very difficult for victims of GBV to live in an abusive home and maintain housing security at the same time. Most jurisdictions will allow survivors of GBV to end their lease early, but no jurisdiction has residential tenancy laws that allow them to remain in their home and have the abuser removed. So if they want to leave the abuser, the onus is on them to leave the home. If they lose their home, survivors often have nowhere to go. So their only choice is to alternate between different forms of homelessness, which is what we're looking at in the second column in the diagram in yellow. For those who are able to leave, about 1 in 5 survivors will live in housing in need of major repairs or in overcrowded conditions. This is also called relative homelessness. 2 out of 5 will live in situations of hidden homelessness, like couch surfing, doubling up with relatives or friends, living in short-term rentals, or sleeping in their cars. 1 in 4 survivors will turn to violence against women shelters and emergency shelters. About 1 in 10 will experience street-level homelessness and will be forced to sleep rough. So just because they live in an abusive home doesn't mean that survivors are safe from being victimized. Survivors will encounter several threats to their safety, whether they're living in situations of relative, hidden, or visible homelessness. If we look at the first box at the top, the first threat is the threat of eviction. So economic evictions are more likely to occur in older buildings, and survivors who live in inadequate housing, they're more at risk of being evicted due to rent evictions and demevictions. This is in addition to the health and safety risks that they face related to squalor and overcrowding. Going down to the second box, survivors experiencing hidden homelessness often have to spend all of their savings and deplete their social supports because they cannot rely on the people offering accommodation forever, and they have to move multiple times to remain sheltered. Going to the third box below, one issue is that there just aren't enough beds in the shelter sector to accommodate survivors of GBV. In addition to a lack of capacity in VAW shelters, there are very few gender-specific shelters, and women and gender diverse people are forced to use co-ed shelters where they are more at risk of being discriminated against and assaulted. And for the last box, when they experience visible homelessness, survivors face even higher odds of harassment and assault when sleeping rough. I just want to make a quick point here that experiences of housing insecurity, they're particularly challenging for women with disabilities because they're more likely than any other group to experience visible homelessness as a result of GBV. This is in part because there are very few housing and shelter options that can respond to their accessibility needs, and in part because they face acute discrimination from service providers in both the housing and shelter sectors. So now we're going to move on to the barriers to housing stabilization in the third and fourth columns in the diagram. For survivors trying to exit homelessness, pathways to housing stabilization are severely limited by housing financialization and discrimination. So market housing is too expensive. There is not enough supply of deeply affordable housing, and there's increased competition for available units. So that means that survivors who are usually economically vulnerable, or if they're financially dependent on the abuser, they just don't have the means to compete for housing that could meet their needs. They also face more discrimination in the housing market compared to the general population. For example, they are asked for more documentation and references in rental housing applications. Survivors who have experienced economic abuse or who have lived in situations of hidden and visible homelessness usually do not have landlord references, and many survivors might have lost essential documentation when they moved, or it's in custody of the abuser. Now, survivors who have been evicted as a result of the abuser's actions or who have been through the shelter system are often discriminated against because of the stigma associated with those circumstances. In addition, many survivors have to deal with mental health or substance use issues as a result of the violence and trauma they experienced. This means that survivors are excluded from accessing supportive and transitional housing options that have abstinence-based policies. This can prevent them from accessing social or community housing that requires survivors to move through the shelter and transitional housing systems long enough so that they were considered to ready enough to be in permanent housing. And in addition, heavy bureaucracy, long wait lists for subsidized housing also make it almost impossible for survivors to secure housing that is safe, adequate, and affordable to them. So what happens then? Well, studies have shown that over 30% of survivors coming out of the shelter system will return to an abusive home for lack of adequate housing or adequate shelter options. To conclude on this slide, survivors of GBV face multiple systemic barriers that put safe and affordable housing out of reach. Because of these barriers, survivors are trapped in successive cycles of violence and homelessness, where they are forced to choose between being without a home or remaining in an abusive home. Next slide, please. So we've seen in the previous slide, the kind of barriers they face along the housing continuum. And I just want to summarize them very quickly here, what those barriers are. First one is economic inequality, which seriously limits the range of housing options that are affordable to survivors. Then there's systemic discrimination, which prevents them from accessing the few options that could meet their needs. There's also a lack of deeply affordable housing. Evaluation reports from housing experts show that not only is there a supply gap, but also that rental housing created under the National Housing Strategy is simply not affordable. There are also gaps in renter protections, including lack of legislation to allow survivors to remain in their homes and lack of enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. Another legal gap that is impacting survivors is the lack of adequate rent control and vacancy control. So even if survivors are able to find affordable housing, they cannot maintain housing security because they could face excessive or abusive rent increases anytime. And then there's the issue of lack of safe and adequate shelter services. Low capacity is an issue, but also discrimination and harassment in emergency shelters, especially against trans women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, and racialized women. Another way that shelters discriminate against these groups is by failing to accommodate their needs. Things like having interpretation services for newcomers, integration of Indigenous cultural practices, or accessible shelter spaces for survivors with disabilities. In addition, there's a lack of trauma-informed services and supports. So survivors dealing with substance use, for example, can go into severe withdrawal when they try to comply with abstinence-based policies to keep a roof over their heads. This places an undue burden on survivors who need supportive rather than punitive interventions to overcome the trauma they experienced. Finally, the last barrier we identified is restrictive pathways out of homelessness, which is a combination of a lack of housing options outside of market housing and limited access to these options due to complex application processes and long wait times. Next slide, please. So without access to safe, stable housing, many survivors are forced to remain in or return to unsafe environments. Here we need to look at housing as a structural intervention in preventing GBV. In other words, GBV prevention can be achieved through improving housing security of women and gender diverse people. We start with upstream prevention that can be achieved through better renter protections and financial support to prevent housing loss. This also requires increasing investments in deeply affordable housing, including social and community housing. So this should be supported by a homelessness reduction strategy that considers gendered experiences of homelessness with an adequately funded and efficient shelter system. Finally, downstream interventions should focus on breaking the staircase model out of homelessness through low or no barrier access and tailored housing navigation services. This also requires increasing investments in supportive and transitional housing programs. And across the entire process, it's important to adopt an inclusive, gender-sensitive, and decolonialist approach to ensure that these interventions are truly responsive to the needs of women and gender-diverse people, especially trans and two-spirit women, Indigenous women, racialized women, and women with disabilities. Next slide, please. So we're going back to another diagram. So if we remove the structural barriers to housing security while providing gender-responsive housing solutions, the result should be that there are more housing options available to survivors of GBV immediately when they leave an abusive home, and ideally even before that. First, there should be more social and supportive housing and fast-track access to prioritize survivors of GBV. Safe at Home programming could complement the range of subsidized housing options available. Safe at Home housing helps survivors to remain in their homes while supporting abusers to transition into a new home. Some survivors might still have to go through the shelter system, so there should be enough gender-responsive shelter options for women and gender-diverse people to prevent survivors from experiencing street-level homelessness. There should also be low-barrier access to transitional and permanent housing options, like Housing First programs, with adequate wraparound services along the way. Finally, having trauma-informed and gender-responsive housing navigation services throughout the process can help lift some of the administrative and financial barriers to accessing housing in the private rental market. Next slide, please. So now we're moving on to what Canadian governments should do to comply with their obligations under international law and address all of those policy and legal gaps. In March of this year, we wrote a submission to the National Housing Council's review panel on the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. In this submission, we issued several recommendations to each level of government to improve housing security for survivors of GBV. In the next slides, we will look at these recommendations and what you can do to push for these solutions with each level of government. But first, all levels of government need to work together to create better housing and shelter options while making sure that survivors are not excluded from accessing these options. This means prioritizing investments in social and community housing, adopting rigorous standards for the design of shelter spaces and services, investigating the nature and scope of discriminatory housing practices, and establishing robust monitoring, evaluation, and accountability frameworks. Next slide, please. At the federal level, there should be a better definition of homelessness that recognizes the many forms of homelessness experienced by survivors of GBV. More funding for subsidized housing options and social supports, and fewer barriers to access these options. And finally, stricter affordability requirements in NHS housing programs so that market housing built with public funds is truly affordable to the households most in need. Next slide, please. So there are a few ways to engage with the federal government around these issues. The second review panel has almost concluded, but you can find written submissions and recordings from the oral hearings on the National Housing Council website. This is also a good way to learn about and connect with organizations that work at the intersection of housing and GBV prevention. Then the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network has prepared an excellent community organizers guide to guide organizations, community groups, and individuals in mobilizing around the right to housing and engaging with review panels. At CCHR, we have published a guide on how to make a submission to the Federal Housing Advocate, which is something you can do anytime without waiting for a review panel to be organized. We also encourage you to endorse the Social Housing and Human Rights Call to Action and sign the open letter from the Demand Better campaign, which are both calling for more social and deeply affordable housing. Next slide, please. At the provincial and territorial level, we want first governments to put safeguards in place to prevent housing loss and evictions into homelessness. This can be done through creating emergency funding streams for eviction prevention that prioritize single mothers, women with disabilities, and GBV survivors, who are the groups most at risk of being propelled into visible homelessness if they lose their home. Another thing provinces can do is to amend residential tenancy laws to strengthen protections for GBV survivors. This includes strengthening rent regulation, applying anti-discrimination laws to all types of living arrangements, and allowing survivors the option of keeping their tenancy agreements if and when the abuser is evicted. Finally, provinces should work on adequately resourcing access to justice mechanisms so that survivors can more easily access legal aid and information. Next slide, please. At the same time, provincial and territorial governments should enable access to more housing and shelter options. They should introduce safe at-home programming and invest in housing first programs. Amend the special priority policy application process to reduce barriers. They should increase funding for the construction and repair of VAW shelters, women's shelters, 2S LGBTQIA+ shelters, and Indigenous-led shelters. They should establish housing and navigation services that are connected to other key sectors like social services, the justice system, law enforcement, or health services. Next slide, please. So to advocate to your provincial government, you can check out our guide on engaging with provincial and territorial governments that explains how to comment on new bills and engage directly with your representatives. If you're in Ontario, we also encourage you to endorse the Fair Rent Ontario campaign, calling for full rent control and adequate income supports. You can also support or join the Encampment Justice Coalition to oppose Bill 6 and the criminalization of homelessness in Ontario. Next slide, please. At the local level, municipal governments can also improve housing security through different measures. They can adopt policies to build and repair affordable housing. So zoning bylaws like inclusionary zoning, upzoning, density bonusing, and transit-oriented development can help create more affordable housing across the city. Enforcement of property maintenance standards and rental licensing programs can help to preserve the existing affordable housing stock. Municipalities can also support a more responsive and efficient shelter sector by increasing funding to build shelter staff capacity in delivering gender-responsive, culturally appropriate, and trauma-informed services. Next slide, please. So in terms of resources to support your local advocacy efforts, we have published a guide on engaging with local governments that explains how to prepare submissions and deputations to City Council. You can also decide to support community advocates in your area or start your own advocacy group. We have included several practical tools to do just that in our guide on community-based mobilization and advocacy. If you're in the Toronto area, we encourage you to join the City of Toronto's Housing Rights Advisory Committee or write directly to the Housing Ombudsman to bring pressing issues to their attention. We also encourage you to connect with the Right to Housing Coalition, which has been working for several years with CCHR on rights-based reviews of the city's housing policies. Next slide, please. So engaging with different levels of government is important to advocate for structural changes. But there are also things that you can do directly as service providers to improve housing security and prevent GBV. You can adopt the GBV prevention framework to support clients and employees. This includes having a clear GBV prevention policy in place, conducting a risk assessment in the workplace or in clients' housing, developing building safety plans and personal safety plans, and other measures. So CCHR regularly delivers legal education trainings to service providers that explain those measures. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Sophie after the webinar if you're interested in learning more about these workshops. Service providers can also work to deliver trauma-informed and culturally competent services, which are essential to accommodating survivors' needs and avoiding re-traumatization. You can also provide accessible and inclusive spaces for survivors with disabilities, including those who have non-visible disabilities. Inclusive spaces and services should also consider the needs of Indigenous clients and clients from non-Canadian cultures. Then having a residence committee can help ensure the equal participation of survivors in the decisions affecting them. Another helpful action you can take is to build a vast referral network to help survivors find the supports they need, including housing and shelter services. And lastly, we all need to work together and coordinate our advocacy efforts to all levels of government. There is strength in numbers, and there is also strength in having a unified message. I just wanted to mention here that all of the recommendations you see on this slide are the result of a research project that CCHR undertook in collaboration with the National Right to Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network on rights-based and gender-sensitive shelter standards. And we will provide a link to the final report in the list of resources that Jenna will send after the webinar. Next slide, please. So before we conclude this presentation, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways or, points for food for thoughts. Housing security is essential to survivors' safety and dignity. Conversely, GBV prevention is crucial to maintaining housing security. They are both upstream and downstream solutions, and coordinated action and collective advocacy are key to making these solutions a reality. So that's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention. And I'm going to hand it over back to Jenna.
Thank you so much, Sophie and Sarah, for that incredibly thoughtful and insightful presentation. You've given us a lot to reflect on, from the structural roots of the housing crisis to the everyday realities of survivors who are facing housing insecurity, and also the policy directions needed to move forward. We really appreciate the work you've shared today, as well as your ongoing efforts through CCHR. It's clear how deeply committed you both are to advancing housing justice. We're really grateful to learn from your expertise today. So we'll move to the Q&A now. And for the audience, we encourage you to continue submitting your questions in the Zoom Q&A. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we can. And so starting with you, Sophie, we had some questions come in about the report that you presented on. Several audience members had questions about diverse and intersecting identities and housing precarity barriers and needs, which I know you spoke to in your presentation. But people were curious about how the research that you conducted captured people from specific groups, such as those with disabilities, people experiencing GBV, as well as substance use issues, and newcomers.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. And I'll say that this research, I think, actually raised, and I think that this is the way it goes with a lot of research, but the scale and scope of this project was quite small. It was a small budget and over a year timeframe, which a year sounds kind of long, but when you have a lot of moving pieces and are trying to talk to a lot of different folks, it actually ends up, unfortunately, being very short, especially when you factor in cold and flu season. So in terms of, I think that the research raised a lot more questions in terms of how this is impacting people than definitive answers. But I can say that what we heard, particularly in smaller communities, is that folks of intersecting identities, and in particular, there are basically just no or very few services where people with disabilities can easily access, or that can, provide space for people with disabilities. And this is deeply concerning because we know that people with disabilities disproportionately experience interpersonal violence or gender-based violence. For newcomers to Canada, in Toronto in particular, we reached out to shelters that were specific to folks who were newcomers to Canada, and some of those dynamics are discussed in more detail in the report. And then I would say, one constraint or limitation of this research is that we were largely, we're largely gathering participants through different shelter and service networks. So our participants were sort of limited in terms of who is accessing those. And we know that many folks who have substance abuse issues are excluded from those, or there's not capacity to manage that, and to manage, many shelters are dry shelters. And so that I would say, because we were across 5 sites and we had a sort of small time frame, and that we were able to definitively, discern some dynamics, but certainly not everything. And there's much more further research needed. I think the thing in particular about newcomers that came to the front too is that folks were traveling really far to access services that were appropriate or that they felt comfortable accessing, which was a really significant issue too. And the report does detail some more of this, but I would say in general, there's more research needed, and there's also some really amazing existing research as well that is cited in the report too.
Thank you, Sophie. We had another audience member ask about the possibility of having mandatory trauma-informed municipal workers in housing, or perhaps housing workers, municipal workers who have education on trauma and violence and gender-based violence. We were wondering if you had any thoughts to share on this suggestion.
Sarah, maybe you can speak to that, because I think it fits well with the shelter standards research project.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think this ties in with the need, like the recommendation that we have about having housing navigation services and having, trauma-informed, gender-sensitive, culturally competent approaches, decolonialist approaches throughout all of those actions and initiatives that we want the governments to take. So it would be great if there was, such a service at the municipal level, but it should also be linked to either a regional housing navigation services or provincial one, because in smaller communities or in remote communities, you need to have that regional coordination. But yeah, definitely agree with that everyone that is working in GBV, in the GBV sector or in GBV intervention, should go through a training on trauma-informed approaches.
And I'll add there too that one of the things that just came up so routinely in our research is that the sector is so woefully underfunded, which I think is part of the same dynamics that have really given rise to the housing crisis that we touched on at the start of this presentation. And the more comprehensive policy recommendations that are in the report and that are in Sarah's other wonderful work at CCHR touch on the funding, the importance of that funding piece too. Because I think that, we're, working in the nonprofit sector as well. And I think as a sector, we need to be resisting doing more, engaging in more work for non-adequate funding. So that's a tricky piece to navigate, but yeah.
Yes, thank you both. Back to that beginning piece, some of the stats that you presented to ground us in what the housing crisis is and how we got here. Sophie, we had a few questions about that. Somebody from the audience asked, can you please clarify the national average rent that you shared? Is that per household, and is it across all housing sizes?
Yeah, so that would be the CMHC national average rent, which would include basically like their estimation of all apartment units and all housing sizes. So you would anticipate that a bachelor apartment would be a little bit less, and a 3-bedroom apartment would be significantly more, probably. I think that metric is somewhat useful because I think it demonstrates how out of reach housing is, but we know there's so much regional variation. And we also know that, as I was talking about, that's going to include long-standing tenancies that were rent controlled. So I live in Montreal, and we have historically had more robust tenant protections. And, I do know folks who have managed to hold on to a lease for 15 years, and that lease is costing them $600 a month, which is certainly not what you're going to be finding if you go on Facebook Marketplace. So all of these statistics, I think, are somewhat helpful for illustrative purposes, but have some blind spots and can't really show the whole picture, of course.
Thanks for clarifying. A question for you, Sarah. Somebody from the audience asked, one of the main takeaways from the latter presentation was to coordinate advocacy efforts to all levels of government. This wasn't the focus of the research necessarily, but could you speak to successful advocacy efforts to one or more multiple levels of government that service providers and/or survivors could use?
Off the top of my head, probably not so many examples, but I mean, one very important example is the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. So that was the result of collective advocacy throughout Canada with nonprofit organizations, community groups, advocates, people with lived experience. So I would say that was a very successful advocacy effort. And yeah, I should have come with more examples, but there are examples also. I really encourage you to look at the work of the Right to Housing Toronto, the Right to Housing Coalition in Toronto, that has been able to influence policy change within the city of Toronto through that advocacy work. Yeah, and I mean, I'm also based in Montreal, and we've seen it, like the work of Quebec-based organization is very impactful. We had last year Bill 31 that was passed that was very controversial, and there were a lot of protests against the most recent rent increase guidelines from the Housing Tribunal. And that led to the housing minister amending legislation around how those rent increase guidelines are calculated, where the part that goes into the landlord's pockets that is supposed to be, the landlord profits is drastically reduced. So there are many, many examples of how collective advocacy can have like long-lasting impacts, but those are the ones that I can think of that have created concrete changes in the legislation.
Thank you, Sarah. Sophie, I have another question for you about the research that you spoke to at the beginning, and I think you and I had a bit of a back and forth about this as well. Someone in the audience was asking, were domestic violence shelters included in the research? And I think they mean in the statistics that you presented at the beginning. If so, Do you disaggregate the results based on shelter type? For example, shelters who serve unhoused folks versus shelters specifically for folks fleeing IPV or domestic violence.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we reached out to all different kinds of programming. We reached out to GBV shelters, family shelters. We reached out to, day drop-in centers and day kind of programming. We spoke to SDV clinics. We spoke to emergency shelters. And we really had a wide range of perspectives included because we were across the 5. Oh, and I should also include, we spoke to transitional housing providers as well. So it was a wide range of different service providers. And because the range was so wide and because we were across the 5 different sites, we weren't really able to disaggregate that data in a way that was really could tell us anything representative. I think that we would need sort of like, we could perhaps, go back in the data and think through some different anecdotal factors. And certainly I think in talking to transitional housing providers, that those were really stabilizing spaces for folks and led to better outcomes. I think, we talked to folks who worked in programming related to the special priority policy and were working with the sort of fortunate, I mean, I shouldn't say fortunate, but like the few people that are able to access social housing, and those outcomes were better for folks. But I don't think from the sort of data and scope of the research that we had that we could disaggregate anything really definitive there, and that more research would be needed.
Thank you. Thanks, Sophie. Another audience member shared that their community is rampant with empty apartments and absentee landlords. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on this?
Sarah, you can probably speak to this a bit more. I think there are sort of experiments in vacancy taxes. I think there's experiments in limiting short-term rentals, and we're sort of at the early stages of these experiments, and we'll see how that goes. But I think that I'll just say, in terms of the research, that was really something that came up in the smaller communities. A lot of units either being purchased as investments and sitting empty, or also used as short-term rentals. And I mean, in my personal view, I think that's sort of an avenue to begin addressing this crisis as quickly as possible, is because we're often, given solutions where we need to build a lot of new housing, but that takes more time than trying to repurpose the existing housing that we have. And Sarah, maybe I'll turn it over to you there.
Yeah, I think you've captured it quite well. There are tools like the vacant home tax that could be helpful to create a disincentive to keep, those units vacant, but they're not vacant just because they can't, they cannot rent because the rent is too high. It's very intentional that those units are not rented. And I mean, there's some concerns maybe around the vacant home tax that this is not enough of a disincentive for property owners who want to use their housing portfolio and housing assets as a tool for speculation. So I'm not sure I have a clear answer on that, but I think it needs to go deeper than that in how the housing market actually works, where we need to find ways to move away from housing as a commodity, financialization of housing, and prevent those kind of, I guess, I don't want to call them predatory practices, but it is kind of. I mean, it's like if you have an entire population that's hungry and you're just hogging all of the bread, then that is predatory behavior. And it's the same that is happening for people who use housing as a tool for speculation.
Thanks, Sarah. I think maybe we'll have time for one more question, and then before we close out with some closing remarks. So somebody asked, as advocates and frontline workers, where do we start? Where do we apply pressure that could lead to impactful change? How can we better mobilize? And Sarah, I know you delved into this in your part of the presentation in depth, but perhaps we can end on this note and speak to this in a brief way as a way to close out the webinar. And as this audience member said, where do you recommend that people start?
Sarah, do you want to take that, or do you want me to touch on that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can start. I think it's like the I don't know, the dilemma of like a drop in the ocean versus a drop in the desert. It doesn't matter where you start as long as you're getting involved. Like every action counts. Sometimes we don't really realize the impact of small action, just like staying informed about what is going on, trying to engage with those organizations. A lot of cities have residence committees or tenant committees that you could join and contribute your thoughts and ideas to those committees, and then it's like this snowball effect where the more you get involved, like the more you'll find ways to be involved, and the more your participation will contribute to advocacy at a larger scale.
Yeah, and I would add too, I mean, I think the information presented in this webinar is stark, and what folks are experiencing and observing on the ground is stark. I think that there's a conversation happening, and I think that there are people pushing back against this idea that, I think people are frustrated with this idea that housing should be an asset and an area of investment, and what the sort of implications of that have become. And so I think having those conversations and, taking those conversations to leaders at different levels is a really wonderful start. And I think there's a lot of people having these conversations. So I'm certainly not hopeless about addressing these sort of interlocking crises. I think that there's forward momentum.
Thank you so much to both of you. And thank you to everyone who asked a question today. Before you sign off, we'd like to take a moment for some important closing remarks and a quick reminder about the evaluation form and certificate of participation. So firstly, thank you to our presenters, Sophie and Sarah, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. Thank you as well to the ASL interpreters, Carmel Cachero and Christy Room, and to our French language interpreters, Caroline Napier and Wendy Green. A special thank you to the rest of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub team as well. A friendly reminder to please complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation. So a link will automatically open in your browser after the event has ended, and please note that it could take up to 30 minutes for the certificate of participation to arrive in your inbox. Be sure to check your junk or spam folder, as it could be filtered in there. Our next webinar will take place on July 10th, 2025 from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it is called Arts for Creative Healing Communities, Gender-Based Violence Work and Prevention with Immigrant and Refugee Families. So we hope to see you there as well. And lastly, the Knowledge Hub has a conference coming up in October called Innovations in Addressing Gender-Based Violence and Trauma and Violence-Informed Health Promotion. And this bilingual conference will share innovative programs and research on trauma and violence-informed health promotion in the GBV sector from the Public Health Agency of Canada's Preventing and Addressing Family Violence, the Health Perspective investment. The registration link is available in the chat. Okay, well, thank you once again for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.